Susan and Jason Pierce had been searching for the right place to settle for nearly 2 years. Not just a house, but a genuine retreat. A space that promised peace, boundaries, and a kind of private rhythm where the outside world couldn't impose its noise and pressures. When they first toured the property, nestled at the end of a curved cul-de-sac in a gated residential community on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, it was raining steadily. The kind of soft, consistent rain that dulls sound and makes everything feel slower, gentler. Susan stood in the backyard, bare trees arching like quiet sentinels around the perimeter of the high wooden fence, and looked at the rectangular pool shimmering beneath a sheet of cold drizzle. Something in that moment settled in her. She turned to Jason and simply nodded. He didn't ask twice. They moved in during the final week of February when the winter was still clinging but already losing its grip. The house was sleek but not ostentatious. A single-story modern build with large windows, minimalistic interior design, and a layout that allowed every room to breathe. Susan, who had spent the past decade working in archival operations at the local records department, had a keen eye for order and structure. She took to the home immediately, unpacking their lives with precision. Jason, who had recently stepped away from his full-time hospital position to take consulting work on diagnostics, appreciated the silence, the unbroken routine of unpacking, arranging, listening to classical music in the mornings while drinking coffee in the sunlit kitchen. Their decision to move hadn't come without reason. 3 years prior, Susan had been assaulted outside her office late at night. The incident left her with deep emotional scars, not only from the violence itself but from the way it was processed by the people around her, with distance, discomfort, and awkward silence. Therapy helped, and Jason was steadfast, but the internal rupture was more complex than anything a few months of recovery could patch. She developed a form of social hypersensitivity. Crowds, prolonged eye contact, the possibility of being watched, even benignly, sent her into a spiral. Her therapist called it anticipatory hypervigilance. Susan simply called it exhaustion. What brought her comfort, oddly enough, was water. Not the act of swimming laps or athletic movement, but the sensation of immersion. She discovered it by accident. An old friend had invited her to a quiet thermal bath during a trip upstate, and for the first time in months, she'd felt truly calm. The silence under the surface, the stillness, the absolute lack of observation. It was a haven. She began practicing a kind of immersion-based body meditation that involved breath control and still floating. The pool, therefore, wasn't a luxury for her. It was an extension of therapy. When Jason began helping her install subtle visual barriers around the backyard, slatted privacy panels, elevated planters with fast-growing ivy, and an angled pergola near the pool's deeper end, it wasn't out of paranoia. It was about control, about giving Susan back a sense of comfort in her own skin. They also decided, for this reason, to swim occasionally without clothes, especially in the early mornings or late evenings. It wasn't about nudity. It was about the absence of external judgment. It was the quietest, most unremarkable intimacy. Two people trusting each other in their private space. The community they moved into wasn't particularly flashy. It was quiet, mostly older residents who valued neat lawns and kept their blinds drawn. There was a governing committee, some internal residential board that occasionally sent out newsletters about community garage sales or lawn maintenance reminders, but nothing had seemed intrusive during the purchase process. The woman who ran the board, they'd heard, was named Karen Draves. She lived 2 houses down in a gray brick colonial with white shutters and a manicured rose trellis out front. She wasn't present during their move-in, and the only indication of her existence was a note in their welcome packet with her name, a contact email, and the phrase, "Always here to help maintain harmony." Susan saw her for the first time 2 weeks after they moved in. She was walking back from the community mailbox when Karen passed by slowly, her hands folded behind her back, moving like a school principal doing rounds. Their eyes met, and Karen gave a tight-lipped smile, the kind people give when they're trying to project warmth but forgot to turn on the heat behind their eyes. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, not slowing her pace. Susan responded politely, but something about the woman's posture, the way she turned her head a moment too late as if studying the backyard gate, left a strange feeling. Jason shrugged it off when Susan mentioned it. "She's probably just nosy," he said, "or bored. People love to invent problems when they don't have any." And that explanation seemed to stick, at least for a while. Life settled into a rhythm. Jason worked from home most days, and Susan adjusted to the slower cadence of suburban life. On weekends, they tackled landscaping projects together. They took long walks through the wooded trail at the back of the neighborhood. Susan began sleeping better. The pool, especially, became her sanctuary. She would float for long stretches in the evening light, breathing slowly, eyes closed, the world beyond the fence ceasing to exist. It was on one of those evenings that she noticed it for the first time. The steam rising from the pool surface had begun to thin, and she was drying herself off on the deck when she saw them. Two faint, larger-than-average wet footprints leading away from the fence. Not their own. They were broader than Jason's, and the stride was wider. She froze. Her heart began to pound, but her rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was condensation, she told herself. Maybe a bird had flapped water strangely onto the deck, but the prints had definition. Toes, arches, direction. She didn't tell Jason that night. Something held her back. Perhaps it was embarrassment. Perhaps it was fear of seeming unstable again, of falling into old patterns of suspicion. Instead, she made a quiet decision. The next morning, she walked the full perimeter of the fence, studying each board, each panel. And near the back corner, behind a climbing clematis vine they had planted for shade, she saw it, a circular pattern carved into the wood, no larger than a bottle cap. At first glance, it seemed natural, maybe a knot in the grain. But, up close, it was something else. It had a slight bevel to it, and when she tilted her head at just the right angle, sunlight glinted through it. She stepped back, every inch of her body humming with tension. Someone had drilled through their fence. The realization wasn't explosive. It came slowly, like the cold. A drip, a creep. She crouched and peered again, this time from a side angle, and confirmed what she already knew. On the inside, the hole had been sanded smooth, as if made with care. She stood, walked back inside without saying a word, and poured herself a glass of water. Her hands were shaking. When Jason came home later, he noticed her silence but didn't press. Instead, he kissed her on the shoulder and asked about dinner. She didn't answer right away. And when she finally did, all she said was, "We need to check the fence together tomorrow. Something's not right." That night, she didn't sleep. And just before dawn, she swore she saw a shadow move behind the gap in the curtains, a slow, human silhouette disappearing past the edge of the yard. She told herself it was nothing. But the pool remained untouched the next day, and Jason, when they finally examined the fence together, didn't laugh or dismiss it. He ran his fingers over the hole, his expression hardening, and said simply, "We're not imagining this. Someone has been watching us." And so it began. The following morning began quietly, but not peacefully. Jason rose before Susan, slipping out of bed and into his morning routine with automatic precision, though his thoughts were restless. The moment his bare feet touched the cool tile floor of the bathroom, the previous day's discovery came flooding back with a sense of creeping unease. The drilled hole in the fence wasn't an accident. It was too precise, too deliberately positioned. As he sipped his coffee on the back patio, staring out at the calm, glassy pool surface, his mind raced through potential scenarios. He wasn't a paranoid man by nature, but he also wasn't naive. Someone had violated their space. Susan joined him quietly, her expression drawn but focused. She had always been observant, almost obsessively so since her attack, and this situation had placed her in an all-too-familiar mental state. Analysis mixed with tension. They both stood for several minutes near the back fence, studying the small, perfectly rounded hole. In the morning light, it was more apparent just how deliberately crafted it had been. Not splintered, not ragged, just smooth wood, cleanly bored through as if with a Forstner bit. The fence section had no external wear, and the soil below it was flattened into a shallow depression. Susan ran her fingers along the inside edge of the hole and felt something subtle, fine sanding. It wasn't a splinter job. Someone had taken time to make it smooth, purposeful, measured. Jason went back inside, returning moments later with a small LED flashlight which he directed through the hole. The light passed easily to the other side, revealing the faint outline of a wooden trellis behind the neighbor's lot, partially obscured by latticework and dormant vines. From the angle, it was clear. This was a viewing hole. Not random, not accidental. Whoever had made it could see directly into their pool area. He pulled back slowly and looked at Susan. No words were needed. They both understood the implications. Their first instinct was to bring it to the attention of the community management. They didn't want to jump to conclusions, but neither of them believed in coincidence. Susan composed a concise, respectful email addressed to the community administrator, attaching a photograph of the hole, its location on their property, and a brief explanation of their concern. She requested that someone inspect the adjacent property boundary for any unauthorized modifications. The message was polite, carefully worded, and yet firm. It was sent before noon. By the afternoon, they had received a reply from Karen Draves. It arrived not as an email, but as a printed letter slid into their mailbox. The envelope was pale ivory, with embossed initials in the top left corner. The contents were short and unnervingly direct. Karen thanked them for bringing to light a matter of structural concern, and assured them that any issues of property integrity were taken seriously by the board. She closed the note with a curious phrase. Harmony within the community is best preserved through discretion and dialogue, rather than assumption and escalation. Neither of them liked the tone. It felt rehearsed, strategic, as though she was subtly warning them against making a fuss. Jason reread the letter 3 times before folding it and placing it in the drawer next to the kitchen sink. "She knows exactly what we're talking about," he muttered, and Susan nodded. They agreed not to reply immediately. Instead, Jason contacted a licensed contractor friend who agreed to come out that weekend and assess whether any similar breaches existed elsewhere along their fence. Until then, Susan made a decision. She wouldn't use the pool. Not until they had confirmed there were no other lines of sight, no more holes drilled into their lives. On Friday afternoon, 2 days later, Susan was walking along the side of the house when she noticed something strange on the exterior siding near the side gate. 3 small scuff marks aligned vertically, as if someone had leaned a ladder against the wall. The grass below had a faint indent, just enough to catch the eye. Her heart rate quickened and she stepped back, scanning the space for any other signs. That night, she asked Jason to check the motion-activated security lights. He did. They were working. Nothing had been triggered recently. Either the intruder was extremely careful or they had found a blind spot. By Saturday, the contractor arrived and performed a thorough inspection. He found no additional holes, no external tampering on the other fence panels, and assured them the structural integrity of the perimeter was solid. Still, he recommended installing additional motion sensors and suggested a few strategic angles for outdoor cameras. Jason agreed and scheduled the installation. That night, they both sat on the patio in silence, sipping wine as the sun disappeared behind the rooftops. The tension between them wasn't emotional. It was tactical. They were both bracing for the next move. The next morning, a new letter appeared. This one wasn't delivered via mailbox, but tucked under the edge of their front doormat. handwritten. The envelope was unmarked. Inside, on plain white paper, were only 8 words. "Please remember, this place is meant to be modest." Jason read it first, then passed it to Susan, whose fingers tensed as she held the paper. The script was neat, deliberate, with strong downward strokes and a distinctive curl on the lowercase r. There was no name, no signature, no direct accusation, just an ominous suggestion. The message implied they had somehow breached an unspoken rule, and that someone was watching them enough to judge. To act. Susan immediately brought the note to the local precinct. The officer who received her was cordial but measured. Without a threat of violence, it didn't qualify as criminal. Creepy, the officer admitted, but not actionable. Still, he encouraged them to report any further incidents and suggested they install a visible security camera, even a dummy, if only as a deterrent. Susan thanked him, and they left with more questions than answers. That night, Jason stood under the pergola after midnight, staring at the fence line in the dark. Something inside him was shifting. Not fear, not quite anger, but a calculated sense of invasion. The idea that someone would not only peer into their home but leave veiled moral judgments afterward was too much. He was no longer content to react. They needed to be ahead of this. On Monday, Susan found herself staring at the neighborhood bulletin board near the community gate as she returned from the pharmacy. A new flyer had been posted, an anonymous reminder titled "Common Standards and Respectful Living." It included phrases like "Avoid disruptive displays" and "Consider your neighbor's perspectives." The subtext was obvious. It was passive-aggressive regulation dressed as a community courtesy. She tore it down, crumpled it in her fist, and didn't look back. That evening, just before sunset, Susan decided to go into the backyard alone. She hadn't been in the pool for over a week. The water sat still and untouched, a sheet of faintly green reflection beneath the dimming sky. She stood near the edge, barefoot, clutching her towel, and stared at the trellis beyond the fence. Something was wrong. A small gap had appeared between 2 slats where the vines had thinned. Her eyes adjusted, and then she saw it. A shape. A flash of pale fabric. The silhouette of someone standing just beyond the wood, pressed too close, still as a statue. She dropped the towel and backed away, slowly, quietly. Her phone was in the kitchen. Her voice caught in her throat. Then, just as suddenly, the figure moved, stepped away from the fence, disappearing behind the lattice. By the time Jason came running outside, there was nothing there. But the pool still rippled, not from wind, not from weather, from movement, from presence. And the quiet harmony of their home had been shattered for good. The morning after Susan had seen the figure beyond the trellis, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere between her and Jason. Not in their affection or their trust, but in the way they carried themselves. Alert, restrained, methodical. They had both crossed a threshold, one that pushed them from discomfort into full awareness that what was happening to them wasn't simply peculiar or inconvenient. It was deliberate, escalating, and personal. Jason, once content to believe the issue was contained within the structure of the fence and its intrusive opening, now began moving through the house with a kind of restless vigilance. He began checking the doors twice, then 3 times. He found himself pausing at windows, scanning for any irregularity in the lines of the backyard. Susan became even more internalized, choosing not to mention the deeper feeling that had gripped her during that brief visual contact with the figure. The icy certainty that whoever it was had not only been watching, but was completely unbothered by the act of being seen. It was a presence without panic, without fear, as though the watcher felt entitled to be there. That quiet arrogance terrified her more than the act of intrusion itself. By Wednesday, the new security system had arrived. Jason had chosen a reputable brand with wide-angle coverage, motion-activated recording, night vision, and cloud storage. He spent most of the day installing the equipment himself, with careful attention to blind spots and battery longevity. 4 cameras were mounted, one on each corner of the backyard, angled to cross each other's line of sight, ensuring no part of the fence or surrounding trellis could escape digital scrutiny. A 5th camera was installed facing the side yard where Susan had previously seen the ladder marks, and another was hidden beneath the pergola canopy, focused squarely at the rear gate. Jason programmed the alerts to ping both of their phones and set the motion sensitivity to the second highest setting, enough to capture human movement without being tripped by squirrels or wind-blown branches. Susan, meanwhile, was cataloging. Every letter, every printed message, every sign of tampering, every odd sighting was documented, dated, and stored in a shared digital folder that could be accessed by their attorney, should they ever require legal action. Her natural instincts from years of handling municipal records made her especially good at this. What she lacked in physical confrontation, she made up for with detail and sequence. She began drawing behavioral patterns, noting dates and times when disturbances had occurred, and mapping their frequency. It wasn't just obsessive, it was tactical. That same night, they received their first new motion alert. At 2:13 a.m., a camera near the back fence triggered a notification. Jason woke first, swiped open the app, and watched the short clip, heart pounding. The footage showed nothing dramatic, just a faint, slow-moving blur behind the trellis. No face, no identifiable body. But the motion was there, just behind the gap in the lattice, lingering for 4 seconds before disappearing. The timestamp was clear. The movement had been real. They exported the clip and saved it to 3 drives. The following morning, Karen appeared at their front door. She didn't knock like a neighbor. She knocked like someone used to people answering the first time. 3 sharp raps, spaced evenly, like a code. Jason opened the door cautiously, expecting a package or maybe the technician who was due to calibrate the exterior lighting. Instead, he was met by the perfectly composed face of Karen Draves, dressed in a pressed pastel blouse and pearl earrings, holding a clipboard in one hand and a ceramic travel mug in the other. "Good morning," she said with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "I just wanted to stop by and mention that a few residents have raised some concerns about recent changes on your property." Jason said nothing. His hand remained on the edge of the door. Karen continued, her tone smooth, almost pleasant. "The cameras, they've caused a bit of unease. You see, when people walk their dogs or take their evening strolls, they now feel watched, observed. It's a bit unsettling, don't you think?" Jason's jaw tightened. "We installed them for our safety, after being watched through our fence." Karen tilted her head, sympathetic but amused. "I understand that's your perspective, but we try to keep things balanced here. Not everyone appreciates being surveilled, even by other residents. It creates a climate of suspicion." Susan had joined him by the door, silent, arms crossed. Karen glanced at her and added, "We just ask that you remain respectful of shared spaces, and perhaps lower your camera angle slightly, just so the aesthetics of the neighborhood aren't disrupted." Jason held her gaze for a long moment. "Are you speaking on behalf of yourself or someone else?" Karen's smile didn't move. "I'm speaking on behalf of community harmony. That's my job." With that, she turned and left, her footsteps sharp against the concrete walkway, the clipboard swinging slightly at her side. They closed the door without a word. That evening, as the sun began to drop behind the rooftops, Susan stepped out to collect the mail. She returned with a thin envelope, white, unmarked, no stamp. Inside, on the same kind of paper as the previous handwritten note, were only 2 lines. "Modesty is not optional. Your behavior is not invisible." No name, no punctuation. The script was the same. This time, Jason drove the note directly to the precinct. The officer on duty logged it, took a photocopy, and promised to flag the address for increased patrol visibility. "We can't act unless there's a threat," he reminded them again. "But if someone steps foot on your property, that's different." Jason asked if they could request a restraining order. The officer explained that without a name or a confirmed suspect, the request wouldn't be considered by a judge. Frustrated but composed, Jason thanked him and left. Susan didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, watching the shadows on the ceiling, listening to the soft buzz of the security app updating each hour. The house had become a fortress, but her mind was no longer safe. The next morning, Jason reviewed the camera footage. At 4:06 a.m., the camera near the back gate triggered again. This time, the footage was clearer. A figure in a light robe or coat walked to the trellis, paused, turned their head, as if listening for movement, and then gently touched the fence slats, pressing against them for several seconds. The face was not visible, but the hand was pale, with long fingers and adorned with a ring, silver, large, oval-shaped, with what looked like an inlaid stone. Susan froze the frame and stared at it for nearly a full minute. "That's her," she said finally. "That's Karen's ring. I've seen it every time she waves." They now had evidence. Not ironclad, not court-ready, but strong enough for a confrontation. They forwarded the footage to their attorney and requested a formal letter be sent to Karen, demanding a cease to any form of visual or physical trespass. The letter was delivered by courier the following afternoon. Karen responded 3 days later with her own letter. It was 10 pages long, typed, printed on watermarked paper, and signed in blue ink. She denied any wrongdoing, accused the Pierces of defamation, and suggested that continued accusations would be viewed as harassment. She copied the community board and threatened a civil claim if they persisted in unsubstantiated slander. Jason read the letter aloud in its entirety, then slowly fed each page into the shredder. But that night, the camera beneath the pergola captured something new. A low rustling near the fence line, then a distinct metallic click. Moments later, the camera's view tilted. Someone had reached up and twisted the lens. Jason ran outside with a flashlight, barefoot and in silence. The yard was empty, but the camera had been touched. The angle was off by 20 degrees. He reset it, reinforced the mount with a bracket, and spent the next hour walking the perimeter. No footprints, no signs of entry. Whoever it was, they were skilled. Calm, intentional. The escalation was no longer theoretical. It was mechanical, precise, and it wasn't going to stop. It was the quiet that unnerved Susan most in the days that followed. Not the absence of motion or sound, but the kind of stillness that signaled retreat, withdrawal, the coiled patience of something waiting to act again. The days stretched long and deceptively ordinary. The sun returned, casting long shadows across the patio and catching in the ripples of the pool like liquid glass. Birds chirped, lawnmowers buzzed faintly in the distance. Neighbors walked their dogs and nodded as they passed. But beneath that domestic calm, Susan and Jason both knew the line had already been crossed, and silence didn't mean peace. It meant recalibration. Karen had gone quiet. No more letters. No more unannounced visits. No new flyers appeared on the bulletin board. At first it felt like a reprieve, but the timing was too coincidental, too perfectly aligned with their attorney's letter. Susan didn't trust sudden calm, not when tension had been building steadily like pressure in a pipe. Jason, too, was wary, but in a more pragmatic way. He focused on reinforcement, adjusting cameras, installing motion lights that flicked on in sequence across the yard, ordering a second set of solar-powered LED perimeter beams. He didn't speak in terms of escalation. He spoke in terms of readiness. It was a Thursday afternoon, 4 days into this strange lull, when a plain white SUV parked on the far side of the cul-de-sac. Susan noticed it through the side window while folding laundry. It didn't belong to any of their immediate neighbors. No logo. No decals. Just a nondescript, clean vehicle. A man stepped out wearing a charcoal gray jacket, clipboard in hand, and approached the Draves house. Susan moved away from the window slowly, out of habit, not wanting to draw attention. He knocked, waited briefly, then was let in. The door closed behind him. She didn't see him again for over an hour, when he left alone, never looking toward their side of the street. That evening, Jason was reviewing saved security footage when he paused a clip from 2 nights prior, something he'd overlooked. At precisely 3:42 a.m., the motion sensor captured a brief flash of light inside their yard, not from the usual fence line, but higher, sweeping across the trees and down across the side of the house in a slow arc before vanishing. It was as if someone had used a flashlight from an elevated angle, possibly a ladder, possibly from within a neighboring yard. Jason enlarged the clip, enhancing the brightness, but the angle offered no definitive clues. He didn't wake Susan that night. Instead, he stayed up reviewing more footage, frame by frame, analyzing timestamps, patterns, gaps. When she came into the kitchen the next morning, he looked tired but focused. "There's a rhythm to it," he said quietly. "Every third night, between 3:30 and 4, always the same part of the yard. It's not random." Susan poured her coffee and said nothing. She didn't need to. She felt it too. That precise, ritualistic invasion. Whoever was doing this wasn't acting on impulse. They were operating by design. Later that day, they met with their attorney in person for the first time. Her name was Lauren Cummings. A calm, sharply dressed woman with a dry wit and a reputation for tireless litigation in civil harassment cases. They laid out everything. The letters, the footage, the notations, the proximity of the viewing hole, and the new activity. Lauren listened carefully, occasionally asking brief clarifying questions, but never interrupting. When they were done, she nodded. "It's methodical. That's good for us. Pattern equals predictability, and predictability means proof." She paused. "I'm going to recommend we begin building a case. We won't start in court. Not yet. But we will prepare as if we're heading there. In the meantime, I'll draft a cease and desist tailored with the evidence and reinforce your standing documentation. And we're going to file a formal complaint with the community board. Even if they're biased, it forces them into a position where neutrality becomes liability." Jason exhaled slowly, the weight of months of tension compacting into one sharp release. Susan, however, looked uneasy. What happens if she doesn't stop? Lauren didn't sugarcoat her answer. "Then we escalate, but on your terms, not hers." That night, they allowed themselves a moment of small relief. For the first time in weeks, Susan sat on the pool's edge with her legs dangling into the water while Jason grilled on the deck. The lights were on, the music was low, and for a moment, the house felt like theirs again. Not a fortress, not a surveillance hub, just a home. They didn't speak of the case. They didn't speak of Karen. Instead, they talked about recipes and travel, and the future they had promised each other when they bought the house. For a flicker of time, they remembered what normal life was meant to be. But the flicker didn't last. The following morning, Susan found a mark on the side of the house, barely visible, etched lightly into the siding near the patio light. It was a spiral, carved with something sharp and thin, and at its center was a single red dot. Paint, not blood, but designed to suggest otherwise. She called Jason over, who stared at it in silence for a long time before photographing it from 3 angles and wiping it clean. No note this time, no explanation. Just an image, an idea. By the time Lauren received the updated documentation and reviewed the spiral mark, her tone had shifted. "She's signaling now," she said. "This isn't subtle anymore. She's asserting presence without direct contact. It's intimidation designed to be legally ambiguous." She leaned back in her chair. "We need an incident, a real one, something overt. Until then, we remain composed." That evening, Susan watched from the upstairs window as Karen stepped out onto her porch to water the plants hanging in ceramic pots beneath her eaves. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She didn't look around. She didn't glance toward the Pierce property, but Susan noticed something chilling. She was humming, a low, tuneless melody that carried faintly across the lawn. It didn't rise or fall. It just hovered, one long, droning sound, almost like a machine left on too long. Susan stepped back from the window, heart pounding. She realized with sudden clarity that Karen didn't just enjoy watching. She felt no guilt, no shame. She didn't believe she was doing anything wrong. She believed she was right. And that made her far more dangerous than they had ever assumed. 2 weeks passed, and the illusion of calm, so thin it might have been mist, finally evaporated. It began with a noise. One of those sounds so subtle and yet so out of place that it couldn't be ignored. Jason heard it first, shortly after midnight. A rhythmic, metallic clinking, slow and methodical, like metal tapping against stone. He was in the living room, reading reports on his tablet, half listening to the low, ambient music Susan liked to play at night. The sound came from outside, near the rear corner of the property. He muted the music, stood slowly, and walked toward the glass door leading to the backyard. Nothing was visible, but the sound repeated. 2 taps, pause, 3 more. He opened the door and stepped barefoot onto the deck, scanning the fence line. Still nothing. The sound had stopped, but the unease it brought settled in his gut like cold water. He stood there for several minutes before going back inside, locking the door and turning off the music entirely. The next morning, Susan discovered what had caused the noise. Along the southern edge of the fence, just behind the hedges, someone had hammered a series of small metal tacks into the wood. 5 of them, evenly spaced, each with a white string tied to it. The strings were cut cleanly at various lengths and seemed to hang in no specific order, but the placement was precise. Jason crouched beside them, running his fingers along the fence. He said nothing at first, then pulled back and shook his head. "It's not art. It's not vandalism. It's a message. It's her." They took photos, logged the date and time, and sent everything to Lauren. She responded quickly, requesting that they avoid contact with Karen and that they install a motion floodlight aimed at that section of the yard. Jason installed it the same day. It was triggered that very night, once, briefly, but when Jason reviewed the footage, the sensor had been set off by what appeared to be a tossed pebble, not a person. Still, someone had thrown it. Someone had wanted the lights to flash. Susan started feeling it again, that constant hum of unease beneath her skin. She spent less time outside. She took fewer steps beyond the property line. Even driving to the grocery store gave her anxiety. What if something happened while she was gone? What if Karen saw her and interpreted it as a challenge? Every look, every closed blind, every parked car on the street began to feel like a calculation. She started writing again, not for therapy, not for clarity, but as a kind of defense mechanism. She wrote everything down. What she saw, what she heard, what she feared. Jason didn't interfere. He watched quietly, holding his own tension in his shoulders and jaw. Then came the incident that changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the HOA compliance officer arrived unannounced. He was a short man, middle-aged, polite but distant, wearing a pale blue polo with the community logo stitched above the pocket. He handed Jason a violation notice without explanation and began photographing the backyard from just outside the fence. Jason stepped outside and calmly asked for clarification. The officer explained that there had been a formal complaint regarding unauthorized structural modifications to the property, namely the security cameras, the floodlights, and what was referred to as unaesthetic fencing alterations. Jason remained calm, asking for the specifics, asking which bylaws had been cited. The officer did not respond to the questions directly, only saying that the issue would be reviewed at the next board meeting and that failure to comply could result in fines or legal escalation. That night, Lauren reviewed the notice and advised them to prepare for a hearing. "This is a maneuver," she said flatly. "They're shifting the narrative, turning your defense into the offense. She wants to frame your reactions as the disruption. It's classic misdirection." Susan listened silently, her face unreadable. Jason nodded, already ahead of her. He had begun collecting not just evidence, but testimonials. Quiet conversations with the few neighbors they trusted. A couple who had noticed strange activity near their own homes. Another who had witnessed Karen pacing near the back gate late at night, whispering to herself. Then one of the cameras went offline. The alert came in at 3:12 a.m. Camera 3, the one facing the side yard, had lost connection. Jason was out of bed instantly. He pulled up the feed. The image was black. He pulled up the last saved clip. It showed movement, brief, fast, a shape passing directly in front of the lens, then static. When he checked the camera the next morning, the housing had been cracked and the lens deliberately smeared with some kind of oil-based substance. No fingerprints, no damage to the wall mount, just the camera disabled. Lauren filed a formal police report on their behalf. The responding officer took it seriously, more seriously than before. This time, there was clear destruction of private property. Still, there were no suspects. No arrest, no charges. Jason replaced the camera that day, this time installing a steel-reinforced casing and wiring it to a backup battery in case of tampering. But he knew the message had landed. Your defenses are not safe. Your eyes can be blinded. And then came the day Susan discovered the mirror. She had gone out back to water the plants near the privacy trellis, which had recently started to wither despite the regular watering schedule. As she leaned in to inspect the soil, she saw it, a small circular object embedded in the vines. It was a convex mirror, no larger than a coin, angled carefully to reflect a wide swath of their backyard. It was tucked so subtly into the lattice that, had the leaves not browned and receded, she might never have seen it. Her stomach turned. She called Jason, who examined it, then stepped silently into the house. He returned with gloves and tweezers and removed it without a word. That night, Susan cried, not from fear, but from the sheer violation. The thought that someone had embedded surveillance in their own plantings, their own green refuge, was too much. Jason sat with her, unmoving, until the crying subsided. They didn't speak about it after. The mirror was added to the evidence log. The community hearing was held 4 days later, in a sterile room with white plastic chairs and the faint smell of stale coffee. Karen arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a cream blazer and pressed slacks, her hair tied back, a thin silver necklace around her throat. She sat in the front row, legs crossed, hands folded neatly. She didn't look at Jason or Susan once. The board opened the session with a discussion of community standards and shared visual uniformity. They referenced the complaint, citing a series of blurry, printed photos allegedly showing non-compliant installations. Susan recognized the photos immediately, angles that could only have been taken from over the fence or through a window. They weren't HOA photos. They were Karen's. Lauren stood and made her statement. Calm, deliberate, armed with dates, bylaw citations, and the quiet ferocity of someone who had done this 100 times before. She presented the harassment evidence. She didn't accuse by name, but every board member knew what she meant. She handed out transcripts, photos, redacted police reports, and a list of other residents who had signed neutral statements about strange neighborhood behavior. The board listened. No decision was made that night. But the tone had shifted. Karen's posture remained unchanged, but Susan caught the tightness in her jaw, the flicker in her eyelid when one board member mentioned a concerning pattern of behavior. 2 days later, their mailbox was damaged. bent inward at the top, like something heavy had slammed against it. The security camera didn't catch it. Jason had adjusted its angle to satisfy HOA requests. Susan stared at the dent for a long time, then simply opened the box and retrieved the mail without a word. Karen had not lost. She had retreated. Temporarily, recalculating, and they both knew the next move would be personal, direct, and far more dangerous. The silence didn't last long. A day, maybe two. Enough to wonder if something had shifted, if perhaps exposure had shaken Karen into retreat. Enough for Susan to sleep one full night without jolting awake at the sound of creaking wood or distant car doors. Enough to breathe with less caution. But then, just as their nerves began to unclench, it happened. It was early morning, not long after dawn, when Jason stepped outside to collect the newspaper, a habit he'd adopted as a way to maintain some vestige of normalcy. As he reached the edge of the porch, his foot caught something soft and strangely warm nestled beneath the first step. He crouched, brushed away the dew-covered leaves, and found it. A dead bird, freshly killed, its neck twisted unnaturally, its feathers still damp. There was no blood, no signs of a predator, just a thin length of twine wrapped once around its claws. The message wasn't subtle, nor was it metaphorical. It was a symbol of fragility, of broken defenses, and of death. Jason didn't tell Susan right away. He disposed of the bird, washed his hands 3 times, and paced the length of the house before finally deciding that omitting the truth would be worse. When he showed her the photo he'd taken before throwing it away, her face hardened. Not into fear, but into something sharper. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She looked up at him and said, "She's not afraid of being seen anymore." That same afternoon, Lauren sent them an update. The board had declined to issue any reprimand or acknowledgement of Karen's behavior. They cited insufficient direct evidence and reaffirmed their desire to remain neutral. Lauren didn't waste time softening the blow. "It means you're alone in this now," she said. "There will be no help from inside. If she's going to be stopped, it'll have to come from real law enforcement, not a neighborhood meeting." Susan and Jason didn't argue. They already knew. That night, Susan couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., she left the bed and wandered the house in silence, checking locks, glancing at the camera feeds, listening for sounds in the dark. She stood for a long time near the sliding glass door, looking out at the pool, its surface black and still. Something felt wrong. Not in any dramatic way. No shadows, no lights, no movements, but in the absence of all of that. It was too still, too perfect. She stepped onto the deck barefoot, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill, and walked toward the fence. As she passed the trellis, something glinted faintly in the corner of her eye. She turned slowly. There, half hidden behind the planter box, was a device. Not large, not obvious, just a black rectangle with a tiny blinking diode. She dropped to her knees, her breath shallow, and reached for it. It was a camera, not one of theirs. She brought it inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and stared at it. There was no label, no brand, no obvious place of origin. Just a single micro SD card embedded inside. Jason found her minutes later, crouched over the device with trembling hands. When he asked what it was, she didn't speak. She simply turned it toward him. They didn't attempt to open the card. Instead, they packed it into a padded envelope and drove across town to a trusted tech consultant Jason had worked with during his medical data projects. The man agreed to examine the contents and call them as soon as he had results. The call came that evening. "There are hours of footage," the consultant said, "from your backyard, close range, some from under your deck, some from near the pool. Night footage, too. She's been monitoring you for weeks, maybe months." Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to. The consultant continued. "And one more thing. You need to know this. There's audio. And one of the files isn't just a recording, it's a message. He sent it to Jason's phone. They played it on speaker, standing in the middle of the living room. The voice was unmistakable. "You've made yourselves into a performance," Karen's voice said, smooth, composed, deliberate. "You flaunt your bodies. You swim without shame. You flaunt your safety. But it's not yours to flaunt. Privacy is not a wall. It's a privilege. And I see through you." The recording ended. There was no background noise, no panic, no anger, just the cool control of someone who believed she was delivering a sermon. Susan turned and walked into the bathroom. She vomited once, rinsed her mouth, and stared at herself in the mirror for a long time. Then she returned to the living room and told Jason they needed to leave the house right then. They packed bags, took the essentials, and drove to a hotel near the edge of the city. Lauren met them the next morning and promised to escalate matters directly to the police. She now had what she needed: surveillance without consent, audio evidence, recorded threats. It was enough. The complaint was filed, the investigation launched, and a temporary restraining order requested. But Karen was not finished. 2 days after their departure, Lauren informed them that officers had arrived at the Pierce home to serve the order and search for additional evidence. What they found was chilling. The back gate had been forced open. Inside the yard, beneath the pergola, someone had hung a set of wind chimes crafted from pieces of reflective metal, polished strips cut from soda cans and old utensils, all strung together with twine and dental floss. The chimes formed a circle, and in the center hung a laminated image, a printed still frame from the surveillance camera footage Susan and Jason had submitted weeks prior. It was a picture of Susan, floating in the pool, eyes closed, arms spread. On the back of the image, handwritten in black marker, were the words, "I watched you, and you looked back." The police took it all: the image, the chimes, the cords. They dusted for fingerprints. They combed the yard. Karen's home was searched that same day. In her attic, hidden behind boxes of old linens, they found a journal. Inside were detailed entries spanning over 6 months. Observations, sketches, records of Susan and Jason's routines, behaviors, what they wore, when they swam, when they laughed. It wasn't just stalking. It was obsession dressed in the language of discipline. She referred to herself in the third person. She described Susan as the Sun Woman and Jason as the Sentinel. She believed they had been placed in her view as a trial, a test of patience and vigilance. She believed it was her role to witness, to correct, to preserve the moral structure of the space she called hers. Karen was arrested that night. The charges were numerous: trespassing, unlawful surveillance, harassment, possession of illicit recordings, and criminal threats. The restraining order was made permanent. She didn't resist arrest. She didn't speak a word. Not to the police. Not to the officers. Not to the judge. But as she was led past the Pierce home, she paused, looked toward the window of the master bedroom, and smiled. A small, knowing smile. It wasn't a smile of regret. It was a smile of completion. 3 weeks passed before Susan and Jason returned home. The house stood exactly as they had left it, untouched on the surface, but marked forever by what had happened. The police had completed their investigation. Karen remained in custody, awaiting trial. Lauren had secured a permanent protection order, and the footage, the journal, the mirror, everything had been archived, cataloged, and placed into the record. From a legal standpoint, it was over. From a personal one, it would never be. The first day back, Susan walked through every room in silence. She touched the walls, examined the windows, paused by the trellis, and finally stood over the section of deck where the chimes had once hung. Jason didn't ask how she felt. He already knew. It wasn't fear she carried now, or grief, or even anger. It was something harder to define, a hollowing out of trust, not just in the neighbor who had violated them, but in the very space they had once called sanctuary. Their home had been breached, not physically, but spiritually. The sense of being seen without consent, interpreted without dialogue, and judged without cause had scarred something in both of them. And now they had to decide what to do with the pieces left behind. They resumed their routines slowly. Jason returned to his consulting work. Susan went back to the records office twice a week, keeping her schedule light. Neither of them brought up the pool for the first month. It sat there, clean, still, chlorinated, waiting. But no one swam. One evening, long after dark, Susan stepped outside alone and walked the length of the fence. It was early spring now, and the vines had begun to return, climbing slowly, reclaiming the lattice with patient green tendrils. She placed her hand against the wood where the hole had once been. Patched now, painted, sealed. She could no longer feel the outline of its scar, but her body remembered where it had been. She turned back toward the house and stared at the warm glow in the kitchen window. Jason was inside, reading, safe, alive, and yet something remained unfinished. The next day, she told him she wanted the fence replaced. Not patched, not repaired, removed, rebuilt, every board, every nail. Jason agreed without hesitation. A week later, contractors arrived and tore the old barrier down. The new design was taller, solid, seamless, no trellises, no shared structures, no blind spots. As it rose, day by day, Susan watched from the window, and each plank brought with it a sense of reclamation, not just of the yard, but of herself. Still, recovery wasn't linear. The neighborhood changed in subtle ways. Some residents now avoided eye contact. Others offered awkward kindness, half smiles and nods filled with subtext they dared not speak aloud. A few whispered apologies when no one else was around. One elderly couple left a small potted plant on their porch with a note. "You didn't deserve any of it." Susan kept the plant, but never replied. Karen's house stood empty. For sale signs went up. They came down. Rumors swirled. About her mental health, about her childhood, about the severity of her sentencing. Susan didn't listen to them. She didn't need an explanation. The journal had said everything. Karen hadn't been curious. She had been convinced, and that was the most terrifying part of it all. One afternoon, while cleaning the storage shed, Jason found something they had forgotten. A weathered cardboard box filled with photos from their first year in the house. Smiling on the patio. Cooking together. Laughing beside the pool. Before the eyes. Before the silence. Before the war. He brought the box inside and set it on the dining table. Susan stared at it for a long moment, then slowly reached inside. The first photo she pulled out was of Jason holding a garden hose, soaked to the bone, grinning at the camera. She smiled, not a full smile, not yet, but enough. They began reclaiming the space slowly, one plant at a time, one meal at a time. Jason rebuilt the deck with his own hands. Susan ordered new furniture for the patio. They invited 2 friends over for dinner. They began to sleep through the night. The house didn't forget, but it forgave. It wasn't until midsummer that Susan returned to the water. She waited until dusk. The new fence cast long shadows over the yard, and the cicadas buzzed low in the trees. She stepped onto the patio, removed her sandals, and walked to the pool's edge. Jason watched from the porch, not moving, not speaking. She lowered herself in slowly, the water cool against her skin. She didn't swim. She simply floated, arms wide, eyes closed, breath steady. And in that moment, beneath the quiet sky, she wasn't being watched. She wasn't performing. She wasn't reclaiming anything. She was just there. And it was enough.